My name is Marianne Hale. I'm 39 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the woman people describe as steady, dependable, reasonable. The one who doesn't overreact, the one who listens, adjusts, and keeps moving forward without making things uncomfortable for anyone else. I've been a wife, professional, a quiet stabilizer in rooms where tension existed long before I arrived. If you ask the people around me who I was, they might say I was easy to be with, not demanding, not dramatic, strong in a way that never asked to be acknowledged. What they wouldn't say, what they likely never realized, is that being calm is often mistaken for being flexible, and being understanding is often mistaken for being expendable. From the outside, my life looked orderly: a long marriage, a shared home, a routine that worked well enough to never raise alarms. There were no public arguments, no raised voices, no obvious betrayals. Just a slow, quiet narrowing of space, a sense that I was shrinking to fit a version of myself that made everything easier for everyone else. This story doesn't begin with an explosion. It begins with a sentence spoken calmly early in the morning, as if it were a logistical update rather than a life-altering declaration. He asked for a divorce at dawn. Not in anger, not with cruelty, but with certainty, the kind that comes from believing the other person will simply accept what's placed in front of them. By sunset, he was on his knees, begging. Not because I shouted, not because I threatened, and not because I revealed some hidden cruelty of my own. What changed that day had very little to do with that morning and everything to do with the years leading up to it. This is not a story about revenge. I'm not here to paint anyone as a villain or myself as a hero. There are no dramatic confrontations, no public humiliation, no sudden miracles. What happened was quieter than that and far more permanent. This is a story about boundaries, about what happens when a woman who has been endlessly accommodating stops explaining herself and starts choosing herself instead. About how silence, when it's intentional, becomes power, and how people only recognize your strength once they no longer benefit from your absence. You'll hear how I was seen, how I was assigned a role that made me useful, reliable, and invisible all at once. How small dismissals accumulated without anyone noticing, especially me, and how the moment I stopped trying to be understood, everything began to shift. I'm telling this story slowly and honestly because that's how it unfolded. There is no rush here, no exaggeration, just clarity. If you've ever been the calm one, if you've ever been praised for being low maintenance, if you've ever realized too late that your patience was being mistaken for permission, then you may recognize parts of yourself in what follows. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently, without accusation. Have you ever been so understanding that the people closest to you forgot you could walk away? To them, I was reliable. That was the word most often used when my name came up, if it came up at all. Reliable meant I would remember what needed remembering, that I would smooth over what felt awkward, that I would absorb stress quietly and redistribute calm so others could move freely. Reliable meant I was rarely questioned, rarely challenged, and rarely checked on. In my marriage, it meant I became the emotional infrastructure. The unseen support beams hold everything upright. I noticed when groceries were running low, when appointments overlapped, when moods shifted before they turned sharp. I adjusted without announcing it. I filled gaps before they became problems. I learned the rhythm of another person's needs so well that my own slowly stopped making noise. To my husband, I was easy. He said it like a compliment, and I received it like one. Easy meant I didn't argue over small things. Easy meant I didn't ask for reassurance. Easy meant I understood when he was tired, stressed, or distracted. Easy meant I didn't press when answers were vague or delayed. Easy meant I trusted the version of him that required the least effort to maintain. Among friends and family, I was the composed one, the one who didn't make gatherings heavy. If something was off, I handled it privately, or not at all. I became known as someone who had it together, which conveniently excused everyone else from asking how I was actually doing. At work, I was indispensable but replaceable. The kind of person managers lean on quietly and praise vaguely. I solved problems before meetings, prepared contingencies no one knew existed, absorbed extra responsibility because it was simpler than explaining why I shouldn't. People trusted me without truly seeing me, and I learned to take pride in that. I told myself this was maturity, emotional intelligence, strength. I believed that being unreactive meant being evolved, that not needing much was a virtue, that wanting less would protect me from disappointment. What I didn't realize, what I couldn't see yet, was how neatly I was disappearing inside that role. No one explicitly told me to be smaller. No one demanded silence. It was more subtle than that. Expectations formed quietly, like sediment. Once I met them consistently, they hardened into assumptions. She'll handle it. She won't mind. She understands. She's not the type to make a fuss. And because I rarely corrected those assumptions, they became facts. I wasn't mistreated in obvious ways. There were no insults, no shouting, no clear violations that would justify outrage. That's what made it so difficult to name what was happening. Everything looked reasonable until you added it all together. The small decisions are made without me. The conversations that didn't include me were because it wasn't necessary. The plans that assumed my availability without asking. The way my emotional labor was noticed was only when it briefly stopped. I told myself this was a partnership, compromise, love in its quieter form. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person others related to and became a function they relied on. And the most dangerous part? I helped build that version of myself. Every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace. Every time I minimized my disappointment to avoid discomfort. Every time I said it's fine when it wasn't, but wasn't catastrophic either. I didn't feel angry. I felt absent. As if I were standing slightly behind my own life, watching it proceed smoothly without my full participation. Still, no one worried, because nothing was visibly wrong. To them, I was steady ground, unmoving, predictable, always there. They didn't notice that even the strongest ground erodes when it's never reinforced. And I didn't notice either, not yet. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment dramatic enough to mark in memory. It slipped in quietly, disguised as practicality, the way most lasting damage does. We were standing in the kitchen late one evening, the light above the sink humming softly. I had just finished explaining something small, something that mattered to me, but not urgently. A change I wanted to make. A boundary so modest I didn't even recognize it as one at the time. He didn't interrupt me. He waited until I finished, nodded once, and said, "That doesn't really make sense, but we can talk about it later." Later never came. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. People dismiss ideas all the time without meaning harm. I told myself I hadn't explained it clearly enough, or maybe it wasn't important in the grand scheme of things. I let the moment pass because it seemed too small to hold on to without feeling petty. But something in me registered it anyway. Not consciously, not emotionally, just a quiet note filed away somewhere deeper than thought. What made it different wasn't what he said. It was how final it felt. As if the conversation had already been decided before it began, as if my role in it was ceremonial rather than essential. In the days that followed, nothing changed on the surface. We spoke normally, ate dinner together, discussed schedules, plans, neutral things. There was no tension to resolve, which made it easy to believe nothing had happened at all. But I noticed myself hesitating the next time I wanted to bring something up. Just a pause. Half a second longer than usual. A quick internal calculation. Is this worth it? Is this clear enough? Is this necessary? I didn't recognize that pause as damage yet. I thought it was maturity. The second small cut came weeks later, this time in front of someone else. We were with friends, nothing formal, just an easy evening. Someone asked a question related to a decision we'd supposedly made together. Before I could answer, he responded for both of us. He wasn't inaccurate. That's what made it confusing. He summarized our situation efficiently and confidently. The room accepted his version without hesitation. No one looked at me to confirm or clarify, and I smiled, because correcting him would have felt disruptive, unnecessary, slightly embarrassing. After all, it wasn't wrong, just incomplete. On the way home, I considered mentioning it. I rehearsed the sentence in my head, softened it before it ever reached my mouth, but by the time we arrived, the moment felt stale, too delayed to justify reopening. So I let that one go too. Individually, these moments were insignificant, forgettable, the kind of things people dismiss with, "You're overthinking it." And I agreed with them because I didn't want to be someone who kept score, but I remembered them anyway. Not as grievances, as data. Each instance carried the same quiet message. My input was optional, my presence was assumed, my agreement was implied unless explicitly stated otherwise. No one said, "Your voice doesn't matter." They didn't have to. The absence of an invitation did that work for them. What made it worse was how reasonable everything seemed. There was always a plausible explanation. Timing, stress, efficiency, no malice, no intent, just convenience layered on top of habit. Oh. And I was the easiest habit to rely on. I told myself that relationships require flexibility, that choosing peace over precision was a sign of emotional intelligence. I told myself I was being gracious. But something subtle shifted inside me after that second cut. I stopped expecting to be consulted, stopped assuming my perspective would be asked for, stopped preparing to speak unless I was certain it would be welcomed. I didn't feel resentful. I felt careful. Careful in a way that made me quieter, not louder, more observant, less reactive. I began noticing patterns instead of moments. And the more I noticed, the more I understood something I hadn't been ready to name yet. This wasn't an accident, it was a precedent. And once set, it didn't need to be enforced. Everyone, including me, began maintaining it automatically. Normalization doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in quietly, wearing the disguise of routine. After the first few moments, those small cuts I told myself not to dramatize, everything continued as usual. That was the most convincing part. Life didn't fracture. Nothing demanded urgent repair. And because nothing collapsed, I assumed nothing was wrong. This is how disrespect survives, not through cruelty, but through repetition. It began to show up in patterns I could no longer ignore, even if I still refused to name them that way. Decisions were made faster when I wasn't involved. Plans moved forward smoothly when my input wasn't requested. And if I raised a question later, it was framed as a complication rather than a contribution. "You should have mentioned that earlier. I thought we were already aligned." "I didn't think you'd mind." Each sentence sounded reasonable on its own. Together they formed a quiet instruction. Keep up or stay quiet. So I adapted. I learned when to speak and when silence would be rewarded with efficiency. I learned which topics invited discussion and which ones triggered impatience disguised as logic. I learned to pre-edit my thoughts so they arrived smaller, sharper, and easier to accept. What I didn't realize was that I was negotiating myself out of the room. I began to internalize the idea that clarity was disruptive, that slowing things down to include my perspective was unnecessary friction. I told myself that being agreeable made me a better partner, a better adult, someone who understood how the world really worked. And in fairness, no one ever explicitly dismissed me. They just didn't wait. If I paused too long before answering, the conversation moved on. If I didn't immediately assert an opinion, one was assigned to me. If I disagreed gently, it was reframed until it sounded like agreement. I watched this happen with a strange detachment, as if I were observing someone else's relationship. I noticed how often I nodded along to conclusions I hadn't helped reach, how often my silence was interpreted as consent. And I let it happen, because objecting felt disproportionate. That's the trap of normalized disrespect. It never feels severe enough to confront. Each instance, by itself, is too small to justify discomfort. But together, They build a system that functions without you. I told myself I was choosing harmony, but harmony built on omission is not peace, it's erasure. At work, the pattern mirrored itself so closely it should have alarmed me. I was included when something needed fixing, excluded when credit was being distributed. My reliability made me invisible. My flexibility made me forgettable. People came to expect my cooperation, not my perspective. And because I delivered consistently, no one thought to ask whether I wanted to keep doing it. I didn't feel angry about this, that's important to say. I felt logical. I rationalized everything. He's under pressure. This is just how decisions get made. I don't need to be involved in every detail. It's not personal. I became very good at explaining away my own discomfort. What I didn't realize was how much energy it took to keep doing that. How often I was swallowing reactions before they fully formed. How many internal adjustments can I make so others wouldn't have to make external ones? I started measuring my words more carefully, not to be precise, but to be acceptable. I watched myself become quieter in group settings, less spontaneous at home. I noticed that when I did speak, I often softened my statements with disclaimers. I might be wrong, but this probably doesn't matter, but it's not a big deal, just... Those phrases weren't humility, they were self-protection. And they worked, at least temporarily. They kept things smooth. They kept me likable. They kept the system running. But they also trained everyone around me to expect less from me. Less resistance, less presence, less weight. The most unsettling realization came slowly over time. No one was forcing me into this role anymore. I was maintaining it myself. By the time I noticed that, the behavior had already been normalized. Not just by him, not just by others, by me. Disrespect didn't feel like an offense anymore. It felt like a misunderstanding I could correct later, if it ever became serious enough to warrant attention. But it never did, not all at once. Instead, it spread thinly across days and conversations until the absence of my voice felt normal, until my compliance felt like character. And once that happened, the role was set. I just didn't know yet how much it would cost me to keep playing it. Roles are rarely announced. They're inferred, reinforced, and eventually enforced, often by the person wearing them. By the time I recognized the role I had been assigned, I had already been performing it for years. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed unpredictability so others could feel secure, the one who adjusted without being asked, the one whose needs were considered flexible by default. I wasn't the decision maker or the visionary. I was the one who made sure decisions landed softly, no matter how abruptly they were made. At home, this meant I became the buffer between stress and silence. If my husband came home tense, I read it before he spoke. I modulated my energy accordingly. I delayed my own concerns until the timing felt safer, often until they no longer felt worth mentioning. He didn't ask me to do this. He didn't need to. I had learned the rhythm well enough to anticipate it. If something went wrong, I handled it quietly. If something went right, it belonged to us, or more often, to him. And if something was missing, it was assumed I would notice and fill the gap. That was my function. I was useful. And usefulness is a dangerous substitute for intimacy. Because usefulness doesn't require curiosity. It doesn't invite understanding. It doesn't ask, "Who are you today?" It only asks, "Will you still work?" The more efficiently I performed this role, the less visible I became as a person. My preferences were treated as optional. My discomfort was reframed as sensitivity. My silence was praised as strength. "You're so understanding," he'd say, without realizing that understanding had replaced being consulted. Friends admired our relationship because it seemed calm, balanced. They didn't see the quiet trade-offs that made it appear that way. They didn't see how often I recalibrated myself to maintain equilibrium. And I didn't correct them. At work, the role translated seamlessly. I was assigned responsibility without authority, expected to anticipate needs without being looped into decisions. My competence made others comfortable delegating, but uncomfortable sharing control. I became the person people leaned on, but didn't lean toward. And I told myself that this was fine. that not needing validation made me independent, that my sense of self was internal, not dependent on acknowledgement. But independence without recognition isn't freedom. It's isolation disguised as strength. The most insidious part of the role wasn't what others expected of me. It was what they stopped expecting. They stopped expecting me to push back, stopped expecting me to say no, stopped expecting me to change. I had become consistent in a way that reassured everyone else and quietly limited me. There was no single moment when I felt wronged enough to leave. No clear boundary crossed. Just a growing awareness that I was being experienced more as a system than a partner. I was the person you relied on, not the person you checked in with. And because I rarely protested, the role solidified. I started to feel a strange distance from my own reactions. I noticed myself responding automatically, efficiently, without presence. As if I were playing a part I had memorized too well to question. The role didn't feel heavy. That's what made it dangerous. It felt familiar. It felt responsible. It felt like who I was. Until one day it didn't. Until a small, quiet moment interrupted the pattern, not with conflict, but with clarity. Not because someone finally crossed a line, but because I realized I had been standing inside one for years. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The shift didn't happen during a fight. There was no argument, no accusation, no raised voices that forced a reckoning. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so quiet it almost passed unnoticed. I was sitting alone in the living room, the late light filtering through the windows, touching the edges of furniture we'd chosen together years ago. The house was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that isn't peaceful, just empty. I had just finished handling something that wasn't technically my responsibility anymore, but had become mine through repetition. A call returned, a detail corrected, a minor problem was resolved before it could inconvenience anyone else. I remember placing my phone down and realizing something strange. No one had asked me to do that. No one had thanked me. And no one would even know it had been handled. For the first time, instead of feeling useful, I felt irrelevant. That was new. I sat there longer than necessary, not scrolling, not distracting myself, just letting the thought surface fully. If I stopped doing these things, what would change? The question wasn't dramatic, it wasn't angry, it was practical. And the answer unsettled me more than I expected. Things would become slightly harder, slightly slower, slightly less smooth, but not broken. Not enough to be noticed immediately, not enough for anyone to ask why. I realized then that my effort wasn't preserving connection, it was preserving convenience. That realization didn't hurt, it clarified. I thought back over the years, over the countless small adjustments I'd made without discussion. The emotional buffering, the anticipatory problem solving, the way I'd learned to disappear just enough to keep everything running. And I asked myself a question I had avoided for a long time. When was the last time someone adjusted for me? I couldn't answer it. That's when the shift began, not outwardly, but internally. I didn't decide to leave. I didn't plan a confrontation. I didn't even feel particularly brave. What I felt was precise. I understood suddenly that nothing would change if I continued behaving the way I always had. And nothing required me to announce that I was changing. So I didn't. I didn't withdraw dramatically. I didn't punish anyone with silence. I simply stopped preempting. I let messages sit until they were addressed to me directly. I paused before offering solutions. I allowed gaps to exist without filling them. The world didn't end. That surprised me. At first, the change was so subtle it was almost theoretical. A half-second longer before responding, a choice not to follow up unless asked, a decision to let someone else notice what needed noticing. I didn't frame this as a test. I framed it as an observation. And what I observed was telling. Some things went undone. Some plans stalled. Some assumptions surfaced without my reinforcement. No one commented on my absence yet, but I felt it. Not as a loss, as space. For the first time in years, I felt present in my own life. The calm that followed wasn't the old calm, the one built on suppression. It was quieter, steadier, rooted. I realized I wasn't angry with anyone. I wasn't keeping score. I wasn't preparing to confront or explain. I was simply no longer willing to carry the weight that no one acknowledged. That day, I didn't change my tone. I didn't change my values. I didn't announce boundaries. I changed my behavior. And that was enough to shift the trajectory. Because when you stop automatically accommodating, you expose the true shape of a relationship, not through words, but through what happens next. And I was about to see just how much my silence had been mistaken for agreement. Silence had always been part of who I was, but now it changed shape. Before, my silence was reactive, a reflex, something I used to keep things smooth to avoid friction, to protect everyone else from discomfort. I stayed quiet because it felt responsible. Now silence became deliberate. That difference mattered more than I expected. I stopped explaining myself in advance, stopped softening statements before they were even challenged, stopped volunteering for a context that no one had asked for, not out of resentment, out of clarity. When something was decided without me, I didn't rush to accommodate it. I noted it. When plans shifted suddenly, I didn't rearrange myself automatically. I asked neutral questions or said nothing at all. At first, this went unnoticed. People are slow to detect the absence of something they've taken for granted, especially when that absence doesn't announce itself with drama. But patterns began to strain. Small inconveniences surfaced. Miscommunications lingered longer than usual. Decisions took more effort without my quiet alignment, smoothing them out. And still, no one asked what had changed. Instead, my silence was interpreted the only way people tend to interpret it when they've grown comfortable, as weakness. He began filling the space where my responses used to be, answering for me more often, making assumptions more confidently, speaking with the ease of someone who believed nothing fundamental had shifted. I watched this with a kind of calm curiosity, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to correct the perception. I realized something important during this phase. People don't notice your boundaries when they first appear. They notice when their access disappears, and my access was disappearing quietly. When I didn't immediately respond, it wasn't met with concern, it was met with impatience. When I didn't agree quickly, it was framed as indecision. When I chose not to explain, it was assumed I had nothing to add, and I let those assumptions stand. Not because they were accurate, but because correcting them would have put me back in the role of translator, caretaker, smoother of discomfort. Instead, I observed. I noticed how quickly my silence was reinterpreted to preserve someone else's comfort. How easily my restraint was reframed as passivity, how little curiosity there was about my internal state, only about whether the system still functioned. That told me everything I needed to know. The silence gave me room to think clearly, without defending myself, without justifying choices, without pre-negotiating my worth. I became more aware of what I actually felt, separate from how it might be received. And what I felt was steady, not angry, not bitter, just resolved. I understood then that silence isn't power by itself. Power comes from knowing why you're silent. And my reason was simple. I was no longer willing to explain my value to people who benefited from misunderstanding it. As days passed, the misalignment grew harder to ignore. Not loudly, but structurally. The system that had relied on my automatic cooperation began to wobble. Still, no one named it. That was the most telling part. Instead of asking, "Are you okay?" the questions became, "Why didn't this get handled? Why didn't you say something? I assumed you were fine with it." Assumption had replaced dialogue entirely, and I didn't rush to correct it, because by then I understood something fundamental. If I spoke now, they would hear the explanation. If I waited, they would feel the absence. And absence is harder to dismiss. My silence wasn't cold, it wasn't punitive, it was calm, intact, and self-respecting. I didn't need to announce that I was changing. I needed to see who noticed. And who didn't. What they never noticed wasn't my silence. It was what I did with it. While the absence of my usual responses created small ripples on the surface, something else was happening underneath. Something far quieter, far more consequential. I wasn't retreating. I was preparing. Not for revenge. Not for confrontation. For independence. I began paying attention in a way I never had before. Not emotionally, but structurally. I watched how decisions were made, who benefited from them, and who carried the invisible weight when things went wrong. I noticed how often my name was invoked after outcomes, but rarely before processes. And I started documenting, not dramatically, not obsessively, just factually. Dates, patterns, assumptions, the way responsibilities migrated without discussion. I didn't frame this as evidence gathering. I framed it as understanding the system I had been holding together for years. At work, I stopped filling gaps automatically and started mapping them instead. I observed which projects stalled when I stepped back, which people reached out only when something broke, which systems relied disproportionately on my quiet labor. I learned more in those months than I had in years of overfunctioning. At home, the same clarity emerged. I reviewed finances with fresh eyes, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I realized how little I had questioned the structure simply because it had worked. I looked at accounts, ownership, and responsibilities. I traced the flow of decisions the same way I would at work. What I found wasn't explosive. It didn't need to be. It was a symmetry. Responsibility was shared in theory, authority was not. That imbalance had never troubled me before because I had trusted the intention behind it. I believed fairness would naturally follow effort, but effort doesn't redistribute power unless it's acknowledged. I started asking myself different questions. If I left tomorrow, what would I need? What was truly mine, and what had simply been assigned to me through habit? What systems could I replicate alone, and which ones only existed because I maintained them? These weren't emotional questions, they were logistical, and they were surprisingly easy to answer once I stopped cushioning the truth. I updated my knowledge quietly, refreshed skills I hadn't needed to assert because they'd always been assumed. I reviewed policies, rights, options, not because I planned to act immediately, but because clarity removes fear. No one noticed this shift because I didn't change my tone. I didn't broadcast my competence. I didn't suddenly become guarded or secretive. I remained calm, present, polite, which made my preparation invisible. That's the thing about people who underestimate you. They don't watch closely once they think they understand you. They stop gathering data. They stop checking assumptions. They believe the pattern will hold, and I let them. There was a strange peace in this phase, a sense of alignment I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't trying to fix anything. I wasn't waiting for permission. I was simply positioning myself so that my future wouldn't depend on someone else's willingness to see me. The most important thing I prepared wasn't financial or legal. It was emotional. I practiced not explaining, not justifying, not seeking validation for choices I hadn't made yet. I learned to sit with the discomfort of being misunderstood without rushing to correct it. That restraint was harder than any argument I could have started, and it changed me. I stopped fantasizing about conversations where I'd finally be heard. I stopped rehearsing speeches that would make everything fair. I let go of the need for recognition, because recognition is optional when autonomy is intact. The irony is that during this time, I was more myself than I'd been in years. Less reactive, less performative, more grounded. Still, no one asked what I was thinking. They assumed I was still the same Marianne, quiet, accommodating, endlessly adaptable. They didn't notice that I was no longer building my life around their expectations. I was building it around my exit options, not because I wanted to leave, but because knowing you can changes everything. And once that knowledge settles in, you don't need to announce it. You just wait for the moment when it matters. The reveal didn't come from a confession or a confrontation or a document slid across a table. It came from understanding. One evening, long after the house had gone quiet, I sat alone with everything laid out in front of me, not physically, but mentally. Months of observation. Patterns I'd mapped. Assumptions I'd tested by stepping back instead of stepping in. And suddenly, the shape of it all became unmistakable. I saw the leverage. Not leverage over him, but leverage over my own life. That distinction mattered. For a long time, I had believed that stability came from staying, from maintaining, from being essential. But what I saw now was that my real stability came from something far less visible: portability. I could move. I could support myself. I could reconstruct my life without asking for permission or approval. The marriage had functioned smoothly because I made it so. Not because it was inherently balanced, but because I compensated for every imbalance quietly. I was the redundancy system, the emotional failsafe, the logistical buffer. Once I recognized that, everything rearranged itself. I wasn't trapped, I wasn't dependent, and I wasn't powerless. The reveal wasn't dramatic, it was sobering. I realized that if the relationship continued exactly as it was, nothing catastrophic would happen, but nothing would improve either. The system would remain efficient, calm, and quietly depleting. And I understood something else just as clearly. If I asserted myself emotionally, I would be framed as changing. If I explained my boundaries, I would be asked to justify them. If I demanded recognition, I would negotiate with. But if I simply removed my automatic participation, the system would expose itself. That was the leverage. Not manipulation, not secrecy. Choice. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. There was no urge to confront him with what I knew. No desire to announce my clarity. I understood that awareness doesn't need witnesses to be real. And I understood something more unsettling. He believed he had options. He believed I did not. That belief shaped everything, his confidence, his tone, his decisions. He assumed my presence was guaranteed, my cooperation infinite, my patience structural. He was wrong, and he didn't need to be corrected yet. The private reveal changed how I listened to him. I heard assumptions instead of words, certainty instead of curiosity, a man speaking from a position he hadn't questioned because it had never been challenged. I also noticed how calm I felt around him now. Not distant, just anchored, detached from outcome in a way I'd never allowed myself before. I wasn't waiting for him to choose me. I wasn't hoping he'd notice my effort. I wasn't afraid of what would happen if he didn't. That freedom altered everything. For the first time, I didn't need reassurance. I didn't need promises. I didn't even need change, because I had already changed. I began to see the future not as something we were building together by default, but as something I could step into alone if necessary. That knowledge removed urgency. It removed fear. And it removed my tolerance for ambiguity disguised as security. Still, I said nothing, because clarity doesn't rush. I waited, not passively, but attentively. And that's when he made his move. Confident, uncertain only of my response, certain of his ground, unaware it had shifted. He believed he was initiating a conversation that would end predictably. He didn't realize he was stepping into a moment I had already prepared for, not emotionally, logistically. Internally, irreversibly. The decision point didn't arrive with urgency. It arrived with options. That was how I knew I was ready. He brought it up one morning as the sky was just beginning to lighten, his voice steady, his posture relaxed, as if he were discussing a schedule change rather than dismantling a shared life. "I think we should talk about where this is going," he said. Then, after a pause that suggested he expected resistance, "I think a divorce might be the healthiest option." He said it carefully, calmly, as though he'd rehearsed it in a version of the future where I would need time to catch up. I listened, not in shock, not in disbelief, but with a strange, grounded stillness that surprised even me, because I had already walked this moment in my mind, without drama, without fear. I had already asked myself what I would do if this sentence ever arrived, and I had discovered that the answer wasn't singular. I had choices. I could plead, explain, recount years of effort, and hope it softened him. I could argue, present my case, try to renegotiate terms that were never mutual to begin with. I could react emotionally, anger, grief, shock, force him into seeing the impact of his words. All of those options were available, and I dismissed them quietly, not because they were wrong, but because they would keep me inside the same system, still performing emotional labor for a conversation he had already framed as resolved. There was another option, one that didn't require explanation. I could accept, not in defeat, in alignment. So I did something unexpected. I didn't respond immediately. I looked at him, not searching for cues, not bracing for reaction, but seeing him clearly, without the lens of preservation, without the need to manage his comfort. And in that space, I understood something with absolute certainty. If I resisted now, I would be fighting for a version of the relationship that only existed because I carried it. If I agreed, I would be stepping into a future I had already made room for. That clarity was decisive. I understand, I said. Just that. No qualifiers, no questions, no counteroffers. He blinked. The room shifted subtly. This was not the response he'd prepared for. I didn't expect you to be okay with it, he said carefully. I nodded, not because I was indifferent, but because I was clear. That moment was the true decision point, not the divorce itself, but the choice to stop negotiating my value. I didn't rush to logistics. I didn't ask about timelines. I didn't ask what he wanted. I told him what I would do, calmly, factually. And I watched as his confidence, built on the assumption of my emotional dependence, began to fracture. He had expected grief, or resistance, or at least confusion. He hadn't expected readiness. That morning, as the day moved forward, something shifted between us. Not hostility, uncertainty. He had believed this was his decision alone. What he hadn't realized was that I had already made mine, and it wasn't reversible. After the decision was spoken aloud, I didn't rush. That surprised him more than anything else. There was no scramble, no frantic reorganization, no emotional collapse that required attention or reassurance. I moved through the days that followed with the same steady rhythm I always had, only now every action had intention behind it. This was the phase where silence mattered most. I didn't announce my plans, I didn't narrate my steps, I didn't seek agreement. I began to separate my life carefully, almost invisibly, the way you would untangle threads you know you'll need intact later. Legal consultations happened quietly, framed as information, not conflict. I asked questions the same way I always did, calm, precise, without emotional charge. I learned timelines, options, boundaries, not to rush toward an outcome, but to understand the terrain. Financial adjustments followed, accounts reviewed, responsibilities clarified. I made no dramatic moves, just ensured that nothing depended solely on assumption anymore. At home, I didn't change my demeanor. I remained courteous, neutral, present when necessary, absent when not. I didn't argue about logistics he hadn't considered yet. I let those gaps surface on their own. And they did. He began to notice delays, friction, the absence of my usual anticipatory support, but he didn't connect it to intention, only to inconvenience. He asked questions that revealed how much he'd relied on my invisibility. Why didn't this get handled? I thought you were taking care of that. I listened. I answered only what was asked, nothing more. I didn't correct his assumptions prematurely. I let reality do that work for me. This wasn't cruelty, it was accurate. At work, I did something similar. I documented transitions, clarified responsibilities, ensured that what I carried wouldn't collapse when I stepped back, but also wouldn't quietly follow me without recognition. The difference this time was internal. I wasn't proving anything. I wasn't posturing. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was simply aligning my actions with the future I'd chosen. There was a strange calm in this stage, a sense of momentum that didn't require urgency. I didn't feel powerful. I felt grounded. And that groundedness unsettled him. He started watching me more closely, asking indirect questions, testing emotional temperature. "You seem fine," he said one evening. "I am," I replied. It wasn't defiance, it was true. He had expected visible loss. He hadn't anticipated quiet competence. And still, he believed he was in control of the timeline. That illusion lasted until the consequences of my silence began to reach him, subtly, structurally, without warning. The consequences didn't announce themselves. They never do. They arrived quietly, the way truth often does, through absence rather than confrontation. At first, he thought things were simply off. Minor disruptions. Small inconveniences that could be corrected with a conversation, a reminder, a nudge in my direction. He assumed I'd step back into alignment once the initial shock wore off. I didn't. And slowly, the structure he'd relied on began to show stress fractures. Things slipped, not catastrophically, but noticeably. Appointments overlapped, details were missed, Decisions stalled longer than they used to, not because I sabotaged anything, but because I was no longer compensating for what hadn't been handled. For years, I'd been the silent redundancy system, the one who noticed problems before problems surfaced, the one who adjusted quietly so others wouldn't feel disruption. Without that buffer, the system didn't collapse, but it stopped being effortless. He felt it before he understood it. There was a tension in his movements now, a slight impatience where ease had once lived. He double-checked things he'd never worried about before, asked questions he didn't expect to need answered. "You didn't remind me about this," he said once, not accusing, confused. "I didn't know you needed a reminder," I replied. That was the moment something shifted behind his eyes. He began to realize that what he'd taken for granted wasn't guaranteed. The loss wasn't dramatic enough to name. That made it worse. There was nothing to argue with, no clear offense, just the steady realization that something essential was no longer being provided automatically. And for the first time, he had to carry it himself. He tried briefly to restore the old balance. Small gestures, casual check-ins, comments framed as concern but laced with expectation. "You've been quieter lately. Is something bothering you? You know you can talk to me." I heard what he was really asking. "Will you go back to making this easy for me?" I didn't answer that question. I answered only the words. "I'm fine," I said. And I was. The consequences deepened not because I withheld affection or cooperation, but because I no longer overextended myself to maintain a comfort that wasn't mutual. At work, similar patterns emerged. People noticed delays they'd never associated with me before. Responsibilities surfaced that had been absorbed so seamlessly that no one knew they existed. There was no accusation, only surprise. "I didn't realize you handled all of that," someone said once, genuinely startled. I nodded. No explanation, no resentment. The recognition arrived too late to change what I was already doing. At home, his confidence began to erode, not loudly, but internally. He grew more cautious, less certain. The decisiveness that had marked his request for divorce softened into hesitation. He started asking questions he'd never asked before. "Are you sure this is what you want? Do you think we're making a mistake?" These questions weren't invitations to collaborate, they were attempts to regain footing. And still, I didn't rush to reassure him, because reassurance would have restored the imbalance. The consequences weren't punishment, they were exposed. Exposure to the reality that my presence had been doing far more work than anyone acknowledged. Exposure to the fact that my silence now wasn't confusion, it was resolve. I watched him wrestle with this quietly. I didn't interfere, I didn't gloat, I didn't correct the narrative forming in his mind. He was beginning to feel loss without being able to locate it. And that kind of loss unsettles people deeply, because it can't be fixed with an apology or a promise. It requires something far more difficult: recognition. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, he was already behind. Not behind in logistics, behind in understanding. The panic didn't arrive as desperation at first. It showed up as confusion, subtle, searching, almost polite. He began circling conversations we'd already had, revisiting decisions as if proximity alone might soften them. "You seem different," he said one evening, not accusing, just uncertain. "Not bad, just farther away." I didn't correct him, because distance wasn't what had changed. Clarity had. He began offering solutions to problems I was no longer trying to solve. "We could try counseling." "Maybe we rushed this." "I didn't realize you felt this way." Each sentence landed a little late. Not because they were wrong, but because they assumed the issue was emotional. That if he could just find the right words, the right tone, I would return to negotiating myself back into place. What he didn't understand was that I wasn't waiting to be convinced. I had already crossed the internal threshold that makes persuasion irrelevant. He started paying attention in ways he never had before, noticing what I did, asking about my schedule, offering to help in areas he'd once assumed were handled. The effort was real. That was the hardest part. He wasn't pretending, he was reacting to loss. But reaction isn't the same as recognition. Recognition requires looking backward without rewriting history. It requires acknowledging not just what you're afraid to lose, but what you failed to protect when it was still present. And he couldn't do that yet. Instead, he spoke in hypotheticals. If we tried again, if things were different, if you'd told me sooner, those sentences revealed everything. They placed the responsibility for awareness on me. They implied that clarity should have been requested, not expected. That boundaries only exist once they're announced loudly enough to disrupt comfort. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to explain. He began to feel urgency, not because I was leaving physically, but because I had already left the role he relied on. And roles, once abandoned, can't be resumed without consent. He tried to restore familiarity, small jokes, shared memories, references to us that assumed continuity. They didn't land, not because I was cold, but because I was no longer available to be pulled backward by nostalgia. The moment it truly shifted for him came quietly. He asked me something practical, something he'd never needed to ask before. I answered honestly, without cushioning. That's something you'll need to handle now. The word now hung between us. It marked time. It marked permanence. He looked at me differently then, not as someone upset or hurt or confused, but as someone no longer accessible. And fear entered the room. Not loud fear, not begging. The kind of fear that comes when you realize the other person isn't negotiating anymore. He asked if we could talk later. I said yes. But even as I agreed, I knew something he didn't yet understand. There was nothing left to fix. You can repair misunderstandings, you can renegotiate expectations, you can even rebuild trust. But you cannot undo the moment someone stops making themselves smaller to stay. That moment is irreversible. By the time he understood what he was losing, it was no longer something I could give back. Not because I didn't care, but because caring without self-erasure had become non-negotiable, and he was only just learning the cost of learning too late. When we finally sat down to talk, it didn't feel like a confrontation. There was no tension in the air, no rehearsed speeches, no emotional charge waiting to be released. Just two people facing the reality that something fundamental had already shifted, and that naming it wouldn't change its shape. We sat across from each other at the table we'd shared for years. The same place where decisions had once been made casually, often without my input. Always with the assumption that things would hold. He spoke first. "I don't understand how we got here," he said. Not defensively, honestly. "I thought we were fine." I nodded. "We were functional," I replied. "That's not the same thing." He frowned slightly, searching for the edge in my voice that never came. "You never said you were unhappy." "That's true," I said, "and you never asked." The words landed softly, but they didn't bend. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount moments. I didn't build a case. I understood that explanation would invite debate, and debate would pull me back into the role of translator, advocate, emotional manager. Instead, I spoke in statements, complete, calm, unnegotiated. "I adjusted myself for a long time," I said. "Not because you asked me to, but because it made things easier. And when things are always easy, no one checks what it costs." He listened more closely than he ever had before. That was evident. His posture changed. His certainty softened. "I would have done things differently if I'd known," he said. I believed him. And still I shook my head gently. "That's the problem," I said. "You needed to know without being told." He looked down then, quiet, processing. I didn't rush to fill the silence. This wasn't about making him understand every detail. It was about being accurate, without cruelty. "I'm not angry," I continued, "and I'm not trying to punish you. But I'm also not willing to explain my worth retroactively." The finality of that sentence surprised even me. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't dramatic. It was simply true. He asked if there was anything he could do now. I considered the question carefully, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted my answer to be clean. "No," I said, not because you don't care, but because I do. That was the moment it reached him. Not as an argument lost, but as an outcome accepted too late. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't accuse, he didn't beg, not yet. He just sat there, absorbing the reality that the version of me he'd assumed would always be available was gone. And I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not relief that the relationship was ending, but relief that I no longer had to compress myself to be understood. The confrontation ended without resolution, because resolution had already occurred elsewhere, in me. There was no dramatic exit, no slammed door, just the quiet acknowledgement that we were standing on opposite sides of a boundary that hadn't existed before. And that boundary held. Who I am now is not louder than who I was before. That surprises people. There was no dramatic reinvention, no sharp edges added, no performance of independence is designed to be witnessed. I didn't harden, I didn't close myself off, I didn't replace softness with severity. What changed was internal and permanent. I no longer mistake endurance for virtue. For a long time, I believed that being strong meant absorbing more, that emotional maturity meant accommodating discomfort silently, that love, partnership, and professionalism all required a certain degree of self-erasure in the name of harmony. I don't believe that anymore. Now, when I enter a room, I don't scan for what needs fixing before I check in with myself. I don't automatically make space for others by shrinking my own. I listen, but I don't disappear while doing it. I've learned that boundaries don't need to be announced dramatically to be real. They just need to be upheld consistently. I still value calm. I still move deliberately. I still choose restraint over reaction, but my restraint is no longer for other people's comfort. It's for my own clarity. At work, I speak when my perspective matters. And I stop volunteering myself into systems that rely on my silence to function smoothly. I don't over-explain. I don't preemptively soften my authority. I allow others to feel the weight of their own decisions. Some relationships adjusted, some drifted away, a few deepened unexpectedly. That taught me something important. The people who only valued my usefulness never truly knew me. And the people who value me now don't need me to be endlessly accommodating to feel secure. In my personal life, I no longer chase understanding. I offer presence, and I notice who meets it with curiosity rather than assumption. I let silence exist without rushing to manage it. I don't fear being misunderstood the way I once did, because misunderstanding is only dangerous when you depend on approval. I also don't feel regret. That often confuses people. They expect bitterness, or grief, or some visible mark of damage. What I feel instead is alignment. The life I'm building now doesn't require me to disappear to keep it intact. It doesn't rely on me being endlessly patient, endlessly flexible, endlessly forgiving. It asks me to be present, and that feels sustainable in a way my old life never did. I haven't closed myself off to love or partnership, but I've changed the terms under which I participate. I no longer confuse being chosen with being tolerated. I don't accept intimacy that depends on my silence. If someone wants access to me now, they meet me where I am, not where it's convenient for them. And perhaps most importantly, I trust myself in a way I didn't before. Not because I've become invulnerable, but because I know I won't abandon myself to maintain peace. That knowledge has changed the way I stand, the way I speak, the way I decide. I am still calm, but now my calm has weight. There is a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a winner. People want to know who was right, who was wrong, who lost more, and who suffered most. They want a verdict that feels clean and decisive, but life rarely offers that kind of symmetry. What it offers instead is consequence. I didn't leave because I was mistreated in ways that were obvious. I didn't leave because of one unforgivable moment. I didn't leave to teach anyone a lesson. I left a role that rewarded my silence, my flexibility, my endurance, while slowly asking me to disappear inside it. And here's the part that matters most. No one took my power from me. I gave it away incrementally in the name of peace. That doesn't make me weak, it makes me human. Many of us are taught, especially women, that being understanding is a moral good, that holding things together quietly is maturity. Asking for less is a strength. But there is a cost to that belief. When you consistently make yourself smaller to keep something stable, you don't preserve the relationship. You preserve the imbalance. And over time, people stop seeing you not because they are cruel, but because the system no longer requires your full presence. The moment I stopped overfunctioning, everything became visible. Not because I made noise, but because I removed myself from automatic compliance. That's the truth most people don't want to hear. Boundaries don't feel dramatic to the person setting them. They feel shocking to the person who benefited from their absence. By the time he was begging, on his knees, desperate to undo what he'd set in motion, it wasn't because he suddenly understood me. It was because he finally felt the weight I had been carrying alone. And even then, I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. Clear that love without mutual awareness isn't intimacy. Clear that being chosen isn't the same as being valued. Clear that no relationship is worth the slow erosion of self-respect. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. You don't need to wait for a dramatic breaking point to choose yourself. You don't need to explain your boundaries perfectly to deserve them. And you don't need to become loud to become powerful. Sometimes the most irreversible shift happens quietly, when you stop negotiating your worth and start honoring it. I didn't walk away in anger. I walked away in alignment. And that difference has shaped every part of who I am now. So I'll leave you with one question, an honest one, meant for reflection, not judgment. In your life right now, where are you being praised for your patience? When what's really being asked of you is your silence. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts, your experiences, your moments of quiet clarity, because these stories don't end when the video does. They continue in the choices we make next.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.